How many times have you looked at the Formula 1 grid and assumed that the drivers on it were the 20 best drivers in the world? Most people assume that, however, it turns out that in many cases that's not true. Because making it to Formula 1 doesn't just depend on talent, but also on money, a lot of money. In fact, it can cost you $50 million. Not the car, not the team, the seat, just the seat. And that's a number that nobody in the paddock says out loud. The teams don't say it, the drivers don't say it, and most of the media don't either. That's why today I'm going to explain to you how much it really costs to make it to Formula 1, the ridiculous percentage of people in the world who can even try, and why the system is designed for this to keep happening. It all starts in karting, a 6 or 7 year old kid with something special in their reflexes and parents willing to spend everything. A season of competitive karting in Europe costs between $100,000 and $500,000, and not because the kart is expensive, but because the mechanics are specialists. The engines are constantly changed, and being at the level where talent scouts can see you requires traveling all over Europe throughout the season, and that's just the beginning. Then comes Formula 4, the first single-seater category. This category costs between $300,000 and $400,000 per season. Then comes Formula 3 between $1 million and $1.5 million. And finally, Formula 2, the last step before reaching Formula 1. This category costs up to $4 million per season. If you move quickly through each level, which takes about 3 or 4 years in total, you will have already spent between $5 and $10 million. And all of that without even having touched a Formula 1 car. However, if it takes you longer and you need more seasons in the different categories to convince a Formula 1 team, that number goes up, and it goes up fast. Because of this, less than 0.01% of the world's population has enough wealth to finance this path. This is not a sport for ordinary people, not even for millionaires. It's a sport for billionaires, and that's assuming they have the results to back it up. Because there's another possibility. There are drivers who spend their entire adolescence on this path, who win in lower categories, who have real results. And at some point they run out of budget and disappear, not because they weren't fast, but because the budget ran out before the opportunity came. And soon after, no one remembers their names. Because in the end, it's money that decides who gets the chance to show their talent, because a career can end long before it even starts, and this is just the road to Formula 1. Because once you reach the top category, the millions just keep increasing.
Digamos que lo lograste, tienes los resultados, tienes la superlicencia y, finalmente, un equipo se fijó en ti. Ahora, hay dos maneras de conseguirlo. La primera es simple, eres tan rápido que un equipo paga por ti. Lewis Hamilton es el ejemplo más claro. Su familia no tenía el dinero y su padre trabajó varios empleos para financiar los primeros años de karting. A los 13 años, Hamilton se acercó a Ron Dennis en una ceremonia de premios y le pidió directamente que lo fichara. Y, teniendo en cuenta el talento del joven piloto, Dennis lo hizo. Así, McLaren financió toda su carrera junior. 7 campeonatos del mundo después, esa apuesta no necesita justificación. Las academias de Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari y Mercedes existen justamente para eso. Encuentran el talento antes que nadie, lo financian y cuando llega el momento, lo suben a Fórmula 1 por su talento y velocidad, no por el dinero que trae. Esa es la vía limpia. Sin embargo, la segunda vía es diferente. Llegas con algo más que solo tus tiempos de vuelta. Un contrato de patrocinio, el respaldo de una empresa o el dinero de tu familia. La promesa es que, si te dan el asiento, el equipo va a recibir 20, 30, 40 millones al año. Y esa situación tiene un nombre específico, y este es Pay Driver. Y lo que llama más la atención no es que esto exista, sino que nadie hace nada para detenerlo. No es nuevo, no es ilegal y lleva décadas funcionando así. El equipo recibe el dinero, tú recibes el asiento y los dos actúan como si ese acuerdo no existiera. Y claro, cuando hablamos de esto, seguro se te vienen algunos nombres a la cabeza, así que hablemos de algunos de ellos. Uno de los casos más icónicos de un pay driver es el de Pastor Maldonado. Tenía méritos reales en categorías inferiores para llegar a la Fórmula 1, pero lo que le abrió la puerta a Williams no fue solo eso, fue PDVSA, la empresa estatal de petróleo venezolana. Según múltiples reportes, la empresa aportó más de $45 millones al año a Williams mientras Maldonado estuvo ahí. Y para un equipo que luchaba económicamente, ese dinero no era un complemento, era una parte esencial de su presupuesto.
Pastor arrived in 2011, and in 2012 in Spain, he took a genuine win against Alonso, Hamilton, and Vettel. He had speed, he had his moments, but he also racked up a number of crashes that no one else on the grid could match, and Crashter Maldonado became an international meme. Also, when Venezuela entered an economic crisis and the money from PDVSA stopped coming, Maldonado's career came to an end. Not because of results, nor because of another crash, but because the checks stopped coming. And if you want to know his full story, I'll leave the video I made about him here. Another well-known case is Nicolas Latifi. His father, Michael Latifi, was one of the investors in Williams. That's why Nicolas raced for that team from 2020 to 2022 without podiums, without victories, and always behind his teammates, causing a number of accidents comparable to others. His most significant contribution throughout his career was his crash in Abu Dhabi 2021, which decided the season. And although there were drivers in Formula 2 with much better results than his, they never made it to Formula 1 because they didn't have his backing. Now, one of the most memorable, despite only being in the top category for one season, Nikita Mazepin. His father ran Alchem, one of Haas's main sponsors. That's why in 2021, Nikita made it to F1 and finished the season as the slowest driver on the grid. But not only that, he also became the most hated. Stupid crashes, controversial statements, and confrontations with practically every driver. That was Nikita Mazepin. And as soon as Haas had the first opportunity to get rid of him, they did. I'll leave a video here with everything he did during his disastrous year in Formula 1. On the other hand, there's the case of Zhou Guanyu, the most nuanced case of all the ones I've mentioned. Zhou was the first Chinese driver to reach Formula 1. He did it with Alfa Romeo in 2022, backed by Chinese sponsors who, according to several reports, represented tens of millions of dollars. His results were better than expected. He scored points, had solid moments, and was involved in one of the most chilling crashes in recent years. But the question remained, did he get there for being the best driver that year or because he brought something else?
Presupuesto que Alfa Romeo necesitaba. En mi opinión,
seconds. But if there was any doubt, now let's move on to what is probably the clearest case of what it means to be a pay driver, Lance Stroll. His case is different from all the previous ones. His father, Lawrence Stroll, not only financed his career, but also bought him the team. First Prema in Formula 3, then Racing Point in Formula 1, and finally Aston Martin. This, not counting the millions in funding that Williams received to let him debut in the category. And Lance has had some brilliant moments, but generally he has been a disaster. I could say more about this case, but I've already covered it in 2 videos linked in the description. Now, if everyone knows about this situation where money matters more than talent, why doesn't anyone stop it? I'll explain it to you. But before that, more than 90% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed to the channel, so if you're one of them and you're enjoying the video, subscribe. The problem isn't any of these drivers in particular. The real problem is that the system produces them. A Formula 1 team spends between $150 and $500 million per season, but the income from results, TV rights, and commercial deals doesn't always cover that budget. And that's where the pay driver comes in. A driver who brings $30 million in sponsorships can be the difference between a team that has its expenses under control, one that gets halfway through the season with limited resources, and one that simply disappears. It happened with Jordan, it happened with Caterham, and it happened with Marussia, teams that disappeared because they couldn't maintain the income flow they needed. That's why small teams have a very clear incentive. Most of the time, they prefer a driver who brings money over a driver who brings speed, because speed doesn't cover expenses, so the result of that incentive is usually always the same. Pay drivers, checkbooks, bought seats, and the fantasy that the 20 drivers on the grid are there because they're the 20 best on the planet. So is this going to change? Probably not, because even today we have cases like Lance Stroll, who seems like he'll stay in Formula 1 for a long time. And if you want to know the story of how his father bought multiple teams for him to race for, built him illegal cars, and sabotaged his teammates, click here. Also, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe, and if you're already subscribed and want to take your experience to the next level, become a channel member. There you'll find a community of fans just as passionate as you and many more benefits.
Y eso es todo. Hasta la próxima.